Imagine a war that lasts half a century. A conflict so deep, the jungle itself seems to bleed. This is the story of Colombia and the FARC. For over 50 years, this vibrant South American nation was locked in one of the world's longest and most complex asymmetric wars. We're talking about over 260,000 lives lost, and more than 7 million people displaced from their homes. But how did it start? To understand this, we have to travel back to the 1960s. Rural Colombia was deeply divided. Wealth and land were controlled by a tiny elite. Meanwhile, millions of peasant farmers, known as campesinos, lived in extreme poverty, struggling to survive on tiny plots of land with no government support. This inequality was fueled by a brutal 10-year civil war known as La Violencia, which left the countryside in absolute chaos and widespread distrust. Out of this chaos rose a peasant named Manuel Marulanda. He wasn't a trained soldier, but he had a vision of a communist utopia. In 1964, Marulanda and his followers declared an independent autonomous zone in the mountains, a tiny communist enclave called the Marquetalia Republic. The Colombian government, backed by the United States during the peak of the Cold War, couldn't let a communist state exist within its borders. In Operation Marquetalia, thousands of government troops attacked the tiny enclave, but Marulanda and 47 of his fighters managed to escape into the dense jungle. This survival became a legendary myth. These 48 fighters officially formed the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, vowing to overthrow the government. In the beginning, they were just a small band of ideological rebels. They used classic hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, hiding in the impenetrable canopy. The Colombian geography was the greatest ally. With towering Andes mountains and vast, uncharted Amazonian rainforests, finding them was like finding a needle in a haystack. During these early years, FARC acted as a de facto state in remote areas, providing security and settling disputes where the actual government was completely absent. But running a revolution is incredibly expensive. Soon, ideological purity wouldn't be enough to pay for guns. They were about to discover a very lucrative, very dark funding source. That shadow was coca. In the 1980s, the global demand for cocaine exploded, turning the humble coca leaf into white gold. This boom gave rise to the infamous Colombian drug cartels, led by ruthless kingpins like Pablo Escobar. They had unimaginable wealth, but a major problem. The cartels needed the dense jungles to hide their mega laboratories and smuggling airstrips. But those jungles were already controlled by the FARC. At first, FARC leaders despised the drug trade, but pragmatism won. They began charging a tax, called gramaje, on every coca crop grown in their territory. It was a strange ecosystem. The farmers grew the plants, FARC protected the fields and taxed the harvest, and the cartels manufactured and exported the final product. This tax generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. For a peasant guerrilla army, it was a staggering, world-changing flood of unregulated cash. Overnight, FARC transformed. Ragged farmers with antique hunting rifles were suddenly equipped with modern assault weapons, advanced radios, and professional military uniforms. But this alliance between Marxist revolutionaries and hyper-capitalist drug lords was deeply unstable. They fundamentally hated each other, united only by geography and profit. To protect their assets from FARC's extortion, wealthy landowners and cartel bosses funded private right-wing militias, known as paramilitaries or the AUC. The conflict mutated into a chaotic three-way bloodbath. The government, the left-wing FARC, and the right-wing paramilitaries were all fighting, creating a nightmare for civilians. As the 1990s rolled in, the dynamics shifted. FARC wasn't just taxing the crops anymore. They started taking over the laboratories and smuggling routes directly. When the Colombian government, aided by the US, finally dismantled the massive Medellin and Cali cartels, it created a massive power vacuum in the underworld. FARC happily filled that void. By the late 90s, the communist rebel group had inadvertently become the largest drug trafficking syndicate on the planet. At their peak, they had an army of nearly 20,000 fighters and controlled a demilitarized zone, the exact size of Switzerland. The Colombian state was on the brink of total collapse. Desperate, they turned to Washington, and the United States was about to answer with Plan Colombia. Signed in the year 2000, Plan Colombia was a massive $10 billion aid package. Its main goal, wipe out the drug trade funding the rebels. Almost overnight, The Colombian military received a massive technological boost. They went from a struggling defensive force to a modern, highly mobile offensive army. The undisputed kings of this new strategy were the legendary Black Hawk helicopters. For the first time, troops could strike deep into previously untouchable FARC territory. But the most controversial part was aerial fumigation. Specially modified planes flew low over the jungle, spraying massive amounts of chemical herbicides to kill the coca plants. The chemicals did destroy a lot of coca, cutting into FARC's profits. But they also wiped out legal food crops, devastating innocent farmers and sparking massive protests. With the primary revenue stream taking a massive hit from the sky, FARC grew desperate. They needed a new way to fund their massive 20,000-strong army. Their solution was horrifying. They industrialized kidnapping. FARC turned human beings into a massive, heavily organized revenue stream, creating an atmosphere of sheer terror. They set up illegal roadblocks on major highways, a tactic brutally named miraculous fishing. They would capture dozens of civilians at random, holding them for exorbitant ransoms. Victims weren't held for days or weeks, but for years. They were chained to trees in deep jungle camps, completely cut off from the outside world. While civilians were taken for money, politicians, police officers, and soldiers were taken as political pawns. FARC wanted to force the government into an impossible prisoner exchange. The most shocking case was Ingrid Betancourt. In 2002, this high-profile presidential candidate was snatched while campaigning, becoming a global symbol of the crisis. Betancourt and hundreds of others languished in the brutal jungle. The psychological torture and harsh conditions were a dark stain on FARC's so-called revolutionary ideals. The war had reached a grim, bloody stalemate. The military had the skies and the technology, but FARC had the impenetrable jungle canopy and human shields. Caught in the crossfire of the military, FARC, and brutal right-wing paramilitaries, the civilian population suffered the most. Millions fled their rural homes for the cities. Colombia was exhausted from decades of relentless violence. But deep within the government's intelligence agencies, a daring, high-tech plan was being quietly formulated. The military shifted tactics. Thanks to billion-dollar funding, they deployed advanced signals intelligence and satellite tracking, turning FARC's own communications against them. For decades, guerrilla commanders felt completely safe in their remote jungle camps. But suddenly, every satellite phone call or radio transmission became a deadly beacon. Once a signal was intercepted, the Air Force would immediately deploy precision-guided smart bombs, striking the exact tent of a top commander in the dead of night. Between 2008 and 2010, several untouchable top FARC leaders, including Raúl Reyes and Mono Jojoy, were wiped out in these devastating surgical strikes. This shattered the myth of FARC's invincibility. Their centralized leadership pyramid began to crumble. Paranoia swept through the ranks like a virus. Commanders were so terrified of being tracked that they stopped using radios entirely, forcing a massive, modern guerrilla army to rely on slow-foot messengers and USB drives. With FARC's communications paralyzed, the government executed their absolute masterstroke in 2008, Operation Jaque, or Operation Chess. Instead of a bloody assault, military intelligence created a completely fake international humanitarian NGO, tricking a paranoid FARC commander into handing over high-profile hostages. Under the guise of a humanitarian transfer, a white helicopter landed in a remote jungle clearing. The rebels, completely fooled, escorted the hostages aboard. Among them was Ingrid Betancourt and 3 American contractors. For a few agonizing minutes, everyone sat in silence as the helicopter lifted off into the sky. Then, mid-air, the NGO workers suddenly overpowered the rebel guards, ripped off their vests, and shouted, "We are the National Army. You are free." 15 top hostages were rescued without a single shot fired. It was a flawless victory for the state, and a catastrophic psychological blow to FARC. Demoralized, isolated, and constantly hunted from the sky, thousands of rebel fighters simply gave up. Mass desertions crippled the guerrilla army's numbers. Look at the map now. By 2012, FARC had lost half its territory and more than half its fighters, pushed back into the deepest, most unforgiving jungles. But defeating them entirely was mathematically impossible. The jungle was just too vast. If bombs couldn't finish the 50-year war, maybe words could. Realizing the stalemate, in 2012, Both sides agreed to sit down. Top-secret peace negotiations officially began on the neutral ground of Havana, Cuba. For 4 grueling years, government diplomats and FARC commanders sat across from each other, trying to unravel 50 years of bloodshed and agree on terms. Finally, in 2016, a historic peace agreement was signed. The international community celebrated this monumental achievement. But back in Colombia, things were complicated. President Juan Manuel Santos put the treaty to a public national referendum. In a shocking twist that stunned the entire globe, the Colombian people voted no. Why? Because the national trauma was simply too deep. Millions of victims felt the treaty was far too lenient on commanders who had terrorized them. The nation was deeply polarized. Interestingly, urban cities largely voted yes for peace, but the rural areas that suffered the brunt of the war demanded harsh justice. Facing a totally collapsed deal, the government made minor adjustments and controversially pushed a revised treaty directly through Congress, bypassing a second public vote. Despite the heavy political controversy, the demobilization process actually began, under the watchful eye of the United Nations. Thousands of FARC fighters finally left the jungle. They voluntarily handed over more than 8,000 military weapons. These guns were completely melted down and cast into 3 massive monuments symbolizing lasting peace. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, once the deadliest guerrilla group in the Americas, officially ceased to exist as a military force, becoming a legal political party. For his immense efforts in ending the Western Hemisphere's longest-running armed conflict, President Santos was awarded the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. And for a brief, beautiful moment, the plan worked perfectly. National homicide rates plummeted to their absolute lowest levels in 40 years. The nation finally exhaled. However, peace on paper doesn't always translate to peace in the jungle. A radical splinter group, known as the FARC dissidents, completely rejected the peace treaty. Worse still, when FARC abandoned their highly lucrative drug smuggling routes, a massive power vacuum opened up. Other ruthless cartels instantly rushed in to claim them. The 50-year ideological war with FARC was officially over. But unfortunately, a new, highly fragmented, and incredibly complex era of conflict had just silently begun. When FARC laid down their weapons, the state was simply too slow to move into the remote territories they left behind. And in the criminal underworld, nature abhors a vacuum. The government had accidentally created a classic Hydra problem by cutting off the single massive head of FARC. Dozens of smaller, deadlier heads instantly grew in its place. The National Liberation Army, or ELN, right-wing neo-paramilitary groups like the Clan del Golfo, and rogue FARC dissidents all launched a brutal turf war over the abandoned smuggling routes. And the dynamic changed. Colombian groups were no longer the absolute kings of cocaine. Powerful Mexican cartels stepped in as the new shadowy puppeteers, financing the local wars. For the military, the strategy had to change. FARC was like fighting a slow, giant dinosaur, but the new cartels are like a swarm of thousands of deadly, hyper-mobile bees. But the most shocking shift wasn't tactical, it was economic. While cocaine remained huge, these armed groups discovered something even more profitable and much easier to hide: illegal gold mining. To extract the gold quickly, they use massive amounts of mercury and cyanide, dumping the toxic waste directly into the pristine rivers of the Amazon and Choco regions. This new shadow economy has unleashed an environmental apocalypse. Hundreds of thousands of hectares of ancient rainforest are being violently bulldozed every year. Caught directly in the crosshairs are the indigenous communities and environmental activists, who brave the guns to protect their ancestral lands and rivers. Tragically, this makes Colombia one of the deadliest places on Earth to be a social leader. Hundreds of environmental defenders have been systematically assassinated for simply saying no. The military's high-tech smart bombs are useless against an enemy that hides in plain sight, blending into local populations and operating in microscopic cells. The battlefield has also shifted. It's no longer just a deep jungle war. The violence has spilled into the urban slums through violent street gangs fighting over local, micro-trafficking. Today, Colombia is a nation of intense contradictions. It boasts booming, innovative, world-class cities, while its rural frontiers remain trapped in a brutal cycle of violence. Yet, despite half a century of unimaginable trauma, the Colombian people are incredibly resilient. Through vibrant art, music, and community, They fight back against the darkness every single day. But as long as there is an insatiable, multi-billion-dollar global demand for these illicit products, the war in the jungle will never truly end. It will only evolve. This brings us to a harsh global reality. Since the 1970s, the United States has waged a relentless, militarized global war on drugs. Over $1 trillion have been spent fighting this war. Yet the global supply, purity, and consumption of illicit substances have only continued to increase. Experts call this phenomenon the balloon effect. It's a simple but incredibly frustrating concept that constantly plagues international drug enforcement agencies. If you heavily militarize and squeeze the drug trade in one specific country, like Colombia, the problem doesn't disappear, it simply bulges out somewhere else. Squeeze Mexico, and it shifts to Central America or West Africa. You are never actually destroying the air inside the balloon, you're just moving it around. Because of this unwinnable cycle, many international policymakers, economists, and even former presidents are calling for a massive paradigm shift in how we handle illicit drugs. They argue that treating it purely as a military and criminal issue has completely failed, and it should instead be managed as a public health and regulatory crisis. Back in Colombia, the government attempted to address this root cause through crop substitution. They offered to pay farmers to grow legal crops like coffee and cacao instead. But it's incredibly difficult in practice. A coca plant yields up to 4 harvests a year, and the cartels come directly to the farm to pay in cold, hard cash. Meanwhile, a farmer growing legal coffee might have to carry their heavy harvest for days on a mule through muddy, roadless jungles just to reach a legal market. Politically, the integration is also stumbling. The former FARC commanders now sit in Congress as a legal party. But they face immense hatred and a deeply divided, unforgiving public. To heal the nation's trauma, Colombia established a truth commission and a special transitional justice system, designed to uncover the brutal, hidden facts of the 50-year war. In a highly controversial move, rebel commanders who fully confess their war crimes and compensate victims can completely avoid traditional prison sentences. This is a bitter pill to swallow. For thousands of victims who lost everything, seeing murderers walking free in exchange for an apology feels like a profound betrayal. But this is the painful price of peace. You cannot end a half-century civil war with absolute justice. You have to find a delicate, highly uncomfortable compromise. Looking back at the 50-year Colombian conflict, it serves as a profound masterclass in the absolute complexities of modern asymmetric warfare and peacebuilding. It taught the world that a war born from genuine social inequality can easily lose its soul when flooded with unregulated, illicit wealth. FARC began with a Marxist dream for the poor peasantry, but eventually morphed into a massive, heavily armed corporate syndicate, driven entirely by the cocaine trade. It also proved that geography is destiny. The impenetrable Amazon canopy and the towering Andes mountains made total military victory literally impossible for the state. But perhaps the most chilling lesson is about power vacuums. Crushing a giant cartel or a massive rebel group doesn't end the violence, it often multiplies it. And we cannot ignore international complicity. As long as people in wealthy nations continue to fund the global drug trade, someone in the developing world will pick up a gun to supply it. So, how do you fix a broken nation? You don't do it overnight. Peace is not a magical document you sign, it's a grueling, multi-generational process of building trust. Today, a new generation of Colombians is stepping forward. They are armed not with assault rifles, but with education, technology, art, and a fierce, undeniable desire for change. The lush jungles, once scarred by bombs and toxic mining chemicals, are also beginning to heal. Nature, much like the Colombian people, is incredibly resilient. Colombia's controversial transitional justice system, despite all its painful flaws, is now being studied globally as a realistic blueprint for ending intractable, decades-long civil wars. Because ultimately, at the end of a 50-year bloodbath, both sides have to painfully realize that revenge only guarantees another 50 years of suffering. The path forward requires unimaginable forgiveness. It requires listening to the victims, acknowledging the dark truths, and consciously choosing to build rather than destroy. Colombia is no longer just a story of war, cartels, and jungles. It is a vibrant, culturally rich, breathtakingly beautiful country writing a new, hopeful chapter. The 50-year jungle war may have officially ended, But this fragile peace is a daily, deliberate choice, a choice that must be protected at all costs. If you want to understand more about the hidden historical forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe to Penguin Story. Until next time, stay curious.